actually part of the public commons. It's something that we share. And therefore, it has this kind of dual character. It's an economic input and one that's undervalued and pretty cheap on one hand. But on the other hand, it's part of the public commons that needs to be maintained for the good of all. So it has a kind of a dual character that makes it challenging to manage. Water is highly undervalued, so it's very cheap because of the level of subsidy. Water governance is highly variable across regions. And the dynamic that you were talking about, that water and oil are different, I think about it this way. I think water is corrosive, oil is explosive, meaning that people do go to, countries do go to war over water. They tend not to go to war over, over oil. They tend not to go to war over water. However, if you scratch the surface of almost any given conflict in the world, there's usually a water story there. So for example, Syria had 4 years of the worst drought in its history just prior to the outbreak of civil war. So did water cause the Syrian civil war? I think you couldn't say that that's the case. But you could say that it created the conditions where war was more likely. So in that sense, it's corrosive, not explosive. And I think that's what you'll find in many places. There are examples of water conflict where there is war, actually, but I think it's this corrosive, always creating tension between people. That's more the kind of nature of conflict. So any questions or comments at this point? I want to make the transition to talk about the COVID case. Okay. Good so far. So that's my Science 101 piece of the conversation. So I want to tell you about the story of the Global Water Initiative that I was part of the team that initiated in Coca-Cola in 2002. I was part of this think tank that the company had set up to look at long-term strategic issues and challenge the management to think beyond just the narrow, everyday kind of quarter-to-quarter pressures and think about what are the strategic issues that really should be on the radar but probably aren't. And early on in that process, we decided that we would focus on the future of water. And as I started looking at the science of water and understanding the dynamics that we just talked about, I got really excited, like, wow, this is such a big issue, critical to everything. I'm in a company that's all about water issues. So if it doesn't have access to water, it's its primary ingredient. It's 98% of everything the company makes, right? So it's strategically really important that the company figures out how to have access to its primary ingredient. So you could make a business case that it actually makes sense to focus on this. It was also happening at the same time that there was kind of growing problems in the Coca-Cola system around water issues, particularly in India. And I had lived in India for 3 years, India and Nepal for 3 years before, and knew the Indian context. And while I started working on water issues, we had this set of reports, which I'll talk about in a moment. But you could tell that the company was either going to be seen as a villain or it was going to be seen as a partner to find solutions to water issues. And it was up to the company to decide if it believed enough in this issue that it was going to try to inoculate itself and put itself on the right side of the issue while it still could. In India, it kind of got too late. So that was kind of the starting point. Coca-Cola is a pretty complex system. It operates in almost every country in the world, bar a few like North Korea. Even there, it's on the black market. It's usually the first business that comes into a new country. So when Myanmar opened up its economy, Coca-Cola Baden plant was the first, global company that set up operations there. So it's a frontier company in a lot of ways. It's a franchise system, so there's the Coca-Cola company, and then there's the bottlers that actually are the ones that buy the concentrate, buy the sugar, source the water, mix it, put it in product, and put it out in the marketplace. So it has about 300 bottling partners, 400 brands, about 900 manufacturing facilities in these 200 countries around the world, and about 1.5 billion servings a day. This is actually outdated. It's probably closer to 2 billion now. So I don't think there's any product that has the kind of visibility or consumption that what Coca-Cola products do. Coca-Cola is the second most understood word in the world.
Wow.
What's the first one?
Yeah.
Okay.
What?
It goes okay.
Okay.
Coca-Cola and then there's Pepsi.
That's right.
Pepsi.
Yeah, you
I'm from Atlanta, so we
okay, you know the story.
There's
Maybe it's full
Like beat it so I can go.
Good, so that's the company context. If you think about the company's footprint, Coca-Cola makes the concentrate, so that's what you see here, and there is some, ingredients and packaging that go into making concentrate, but it's concentrate, so it's actually not very much raw material. So the company is not the one that's consuming all of the water. The concentrate is sold to the bottling plants, and then the bottling plants are the ones that mix it with the water and the sugar and the other ingredients, put it in a bottle, and put it out in the marketplace. So in a franchise system, Coke actually is not the one that has the footprint directly. It's the bottling system, which typically are independent companies, with their own shares owned by their own shareholders. Once the product is bottled, it goes to warehouses, out to transport to vending machines and customers, and ultimately to the person who consumes the product. Yeah.
So in that kind of system, does Coke overall have corporate liability? The branches, like what exactly
Yeah.
is the relationship?
That's a good question. So, Coke has a set of standards that they require the bottlers to adhere to, and they run the risk of losing their license if they don't follow those standards. But the companies are independent, and so there's always this kind of degree of separation. From the company's perspective, they used to say when there was a problem in the bottling network, they said, oh, well, that's the bottle, that's not us. That doesn't go over very well with most people who don't know this company. They're like, it's a big red truck that says Coca-Cola on it, that's Coca-Cola. So what you're legally responsible for and what you're accountable to for the public are actually two different things in this case. So yes?
So does Coca-Cola taste different depending on which it comes from because water has different tastes?
Mostly because the sweeteners are different.
Yeah,
So
okay.
the water is put through a multi-barrier treatment system, and so pretty much all the stuff is stripped out of whatever the local water is. So I don't think there's a big difference in the quality of the water that goes into the product. But the sweeteners are different, and probably the amount of concentrate they put and so forth also is different. Yes?
And what, because I know, for example, Mexican Coke is way different than
Yeah.
Coke used to have.
Because that's sugar.
Yeah, just it's way better. Are there other ways, in different countries in which this differs as well? Are there, like, for example, cane sugar used to?
Yeah, it's actually cane sugar, beet sugar, high fructose corn syrup are kind of the big sweeteners.
Okay.
And now the non-calorie sweeteners like stevia that are used in some of their products. So there's a range of different sweeteners, and then you can use them in different combinations.
Okay.
So in different markets, you'll find different things. Mexican Coca-Cola is made with cane sugar, and in the U.S., high fructose corn syrup is essentially free because of the government subsidy.
Right.
So that's why they use high fructose corn syrup. So this also goes back to government policy, right?
Yeah.
We could talk a lot about the pros and cons of that. So, but that's essentially where you'd find the difference. The concentrate is highly protected. They only take people that work for the company for 20 years to work in these plants. I never found out where these plants were. The secret formula, yeah, I mean, it's a big deal. There's only two people that know it. They don't fly in the same plane.
Is that actually true?
Yeah.
Who are the two people?
No, don't know.
You don't know?
I have to kill you.
What's your favorite Coke?
I'm out of the business now. I don't have a favorite. Let me go on and tell you the story of how this water issue got moving inside the company. We launched the Global Water Initiative at about the same time that the company started getting in trouble in India. There was a local plant that was in a place that had a lot of drought. It actually was in the state of India where my wife, her family is from. So I knew, I could call her relatives and find out what was going on with the local politics there. But there were a group of activists that started writing articles saying Coca-Cola is stealing water from poor people. This is terrible. You should protest. Boycott Coca-Cola. Historically, these kind of local things happen all the time. It probably wouldn't have made a very big deal. But this was kind of at the advent of social media, and these issues began to kind of grow in visibility globally. there was a activist, an Indian activist who moved to San Francisco, lived in a one-room apartment in San Francisco, but he created something called the India Resource Center, and he started reposting all of these articles from the activists in India, saying what a bad company Coca-Cola was because they're stealing water from the poor. That eventually got the attention of some school children there was a letter writing campaign in Singapore that school children started sending to the CEO saying, why are you stealing water from the poor? Anita Roddick, the former CEO of the Body Shop, was like, this is a sign of just a bad company, you should boycott it. So, picked up by the activist community, but sort of the business, relevant activist community with Anita Roddick. Growing international scrutiny, so the BBC sent journalists to India to talk to the local villagers and came back with a not very positive story about what was going on locally. And there's this whole debate in India about whether Coke was actually using water from the same aquifer as the local community. But these are, things that are pretty tough to see, right? Under the ground, you don't actually know where the pipes are drawing from. So these questions were all very contested. That led to a global movement against Coca-Cola, where activists started taking on the company. This is, I think, in front of the Coca-Cola building in New York where I worked. So we used to regularly have to go out the back entrance of the company because there was protests happening on the street in front with hundreds of activists. So this got to be a pretty hot issue. Eventually it was picked up by universities. So University of Michigan, several universities launched a boycott of Coca-Cola products because of this issue and because of some labor issues that were going on in Colombia at the same time. So this became kind of a hot issue. People say, was that the reason Coke launched the global water strategy? It really isn't. They grew up together though, and I felt like this was very useful to make the case back to the company that this isn't just like make-believe, like these risks are real, they can cost the company money, they can damage the brand in ways that they should pay attention to. So this whole idea of social license to operate was now actually, we had a real case study of that. So based on that, we launched the Global Water Initiative, and essentially this is a kind of a map. It's not, rocket science. The idea basically was, what's the company's water use? What risk does the company have around water? Are there opportunities to do the right thing around water? How do you set the strategic direction, and then can you actually implement it? So strategy development 101. And what I want to spend some time on is talking about this idea of risk, because this is often, if you are working on these kinds of issues in companies, you can't talk about the global crisis. You have to be able to translate it into some way that the company could feel the impact of these issues on its bottom line. And risk is one way to do that. It's to say, look, there's a whole set of issues that are happening in the world that if the company doesn't respond positively to, could cost the company a lot of money. Or flip side of that is, there is an opportunity around some big challenge that the company can do something about, and it can either drive its revenue, improve its reputation, define, new business opportunities that can help drive its case if it addresses those issues. So essentially that translation into the context of the business, risk is a good way to do that. So for our risk assessment, we did a few things. One is we did spatial analysis. I showed you that 60-kilometer by 60-kilometer map, and I'll give a little bit more detail on that. The second thing we did was we started writing risk reports. Coke, bottlers, the Coca-Cola company is broken up into 23 different divisions. And so those different divisions in each of the geographies all had different kinds of water issues, but what was relevant in Africa was quite different than what was happening in Latin America or Europe. So we started writing these reports for the different divisions around the world saying, okay, we've gone out and we looked at external data, and we looked at your performance in the plants, and we sort of synthesized a point of view on what are the risks for this division. And we sent these reports out to the field. Every one of them they hated. So we sent these reports out, and they'd say, oh, this is crap, basically. You don't understand our business. You don't know, the local political situation. You say that's a big risk. We think it's a small risk. You spelled the name of that river accurate representation. So revisions are a very important part of the process because it allows groups to kind of come together around a shared view of what's actually happening in the world. So that was not wasted time. It was very laborious, but really helpful. And the last thing we did is, you know, after we did these reports for these 23 divisions, they said, well, that's fine, but you're telling us about issues in Southeast Asia. What can you tell us about the plants themselves? Because there are 900 bottling plants. It really matters what's happening at the plant, right? We don't know anything about the plants, so we did a survey and we gathered data from these 900 plants. It was about a 300 question survey. It took about 10 hours per bottling plant to complete it. And people said, oh, you know, you're crazy. You'll never get these bottling companies to do the survey. But we were able to kind of pull the right levers inside the company, getting senior management involved to kind of mandate it. A lot of techniques that we used, and we got 92% of the plants to actually go through and complete the survey. So then we had local data driven from the plant level up, and I'll show you some of the results of that. So I'm going to spend most of the rest of the time talking about the risk assessment, and we'll talk about what we did. So this is a map of Africa, obviously, and it shows the subnational water availability across the region. Each of the dots is a bottling plant. The size of the dot is the size of the bottling plant, how much production volume it has. The color of the dot is how water efficient they are. So the company was measuring how much water goes into each of the bottling plants and then how much product goes out. That's called the water use ratio. So we measured that in every plant they had for several years, and some of those plants used a lot of water. Some way more actually than the rest of the world. So if you look at the spectrum, it goes from 1 to 2 liters of water per liter of product. And the most efficient plants that are green, I don't think there's any of them here. Most of them are in the 3 to 4, all the way up to 21. So why do you think Africa would have so many apparently inefficient plants? Anyone been to Africa? Drank a Coke? Where'd you drink it?